The main issue with Borderlands 4 is performance. The game is unreasonably taxing on the highest badass preset, and it looks quite bad when dropping down to low. But how does it compare to Borderlands 3? I've seen a lot of comments bemoaning how Borderlands 4 is not a huge visual improvement on Borderlands 3, at least not to the degree that would justify the performance, and that Borderlands 3 simply runs a lot better. But is this actually true? Well, let's find out.
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Gigabyte and their Aorus Radeon RX 9070 XT Elite, one of the most feature-packed 9070 XTs on the market, and arguably the best looking, thanks to the RGB halo design, a triple ring lighting effect that provides unique visuals. But the Aorus Elite isn't just a flashy looking graphics card, it packs a massive vapor chamber cooler that allows it to sustain the highest core clocks of any 9070 XT that we've tested, and we've tested pretty much all of them. This resulted in some of the best out-of-the-box performance, and combine that with the strong feature set, which includes dual BIOS support, massive aluminium backplate with pass-through area, dual HDMI outputs, ARGB lighting, a GPU support that includes a wide range of adjustment, and you have a real winner. Which is why we recommend checking out Gigabyte's Aorus Radeon RX 9070 XT Elite via the link in the video description.
Borderlands 3 is a reasonably old game now, having launched 6 years ago in September 2019. It uses the prior version of Unreal Engine, Unreal Engine 4, as opposed to Borderlands 4 that is upgraded to Unreal Engine 5. It's essentially a last generation game having targeted the PlayStation 4 at launch, whereas Borderlands 4 targeted the PlayStation 5 and omitted support for last gen consoles. So theoretically we should be getting a generational leap in the experience. What's interesting is that back in 2019, we actually made a Borderlands 3 optimization guide and had this to say at the time about its performance. It's also quite a performance-intensive title, requiring an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 2080 Ti to get even close to 60 FPS gameplay at 4K using ultra settings. Now, I'm a huge fan of the Borderlands art style, and I think Borderlands 3 looks pretty great, but I also don't think its visual quality justifies such taxing performance. Whether this means the game is poorly optimized or just has some really intensive visual effects, well, we'll find out in today's video. Well, that all sounds pretty familiar. Borderlands 4 struggles to hit 60 FPS at 4K on an RTX 5090, so not much has changed in this franchise over the years. But let's now do a direct comparison between the two games on a GeForce RTX 5060 Ti 16GB to see just how much harder it is to run the latest iteration in the franchise. In this comparison, I'm running both Borderlands 3 and Borderlands 4 on the badass preset at 1440p. Borderlands 4 is using DLSS 4 quality upscaling, as that's how most people would play the game in this configuration. Borderlands 3 is not using upscaling, as the game does not support it, and motion blur is disabled, so we get a clearer look at the visuals. I started out this walk just outside one of the base areas in the game, and in Borderlands 3 this is one of the larger available maps. On the same hardware, at the same labeled settings, Borderlands 4 is about 3 times harder to run. Borderlands 3 actually runs really well on the RTX 5060 Ti, achieving over 120 FPS in most scenarios, including this one. But Borderlands 4 is only running at around 43 FPS, and that's with upscaling enabled. Now, this isn't a particularly incredible part of the game visually, but it's pretty clear that Borderlands 4 is the better looking game with increased levels of detail and better lighting quality. I'll explore this a little more in a moment, but at the very least it's not like we're getting the same visual experience at 1/3 the frame rate. However, things do change a bit in that discussion when we compare Borderlands 3 running on the badass preset to Borderlands 4 running on the low preset. In this very same area, I was only able to scale Borderlands 4 down to run at 95 FPS compared to 126 FPS in the previous title. So the highest settings in Borderlands 3 run about 30% faster than the lowest settings in Borderlands 4 in this configuration, which is a pretty dire state of affairs for people with older graphics cards. You just can't scale things down far enough. To make matters worse for this comparison, Borderlands 4 is a pretty clear downgrade in overall visual quality running on the low settings compared to Borderlands 3 on badass. A lot of this is due to the low settings nerfing detail and texture quality by massively reducing grass density and turning anisotropic filtering down way too far. On top of this, we get a lot of texture pop-in as the low texture settings seem to reduce the texture pool size, so muddy textures occasionally appear when moving around. Then for lighting quality, the low settings aren't always terrible, but shadow quality is noticeably reduced and has plenty of aliasing issues. Now, Borderlands 3 on the Badass preset isn't a cutting-edge game visually, so it doesn't hold up compared to the latest and greatest PC titles, but with much higher texture quality and a decent amount of detail, it obviously looks better than Borderlands 4 on low. Shadows are also sharper and don't have the grain and aliasing we see in the Borderlands 4 image, which makes it a more pleasant experience to move around. A lot of these issues are also present while driving around. Borderlands 4 on low is just a really muddy and flat experience that is unpleasant to look at, while Borderlands 3 looks better and runs at least 20% faster in this comparison. This is a clear failure of the newer game to scale down to the level that Borderlands 3 provided previously. Yes, the higher settings look better, but the lowest settings look worse than previous games have shown they could be. This is comparing the games using a modern GPU though. The RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, while a mainstream model in 2025, is actually faster than the RTX 2080 Ti, which was the flagship GPU at the time Borderlands 3 launched. So it's not a huge surprise that the game runs better on modern hardware than it did back when it launched. But this got me thinking, how do these two Borderlands games compare when running each one on hardware from the time of release? So for Borderlands 4, we have the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB as a mainstream model. It costs about $430 US. Back in 2019, if you had $430 to spend on a GPU to play Borderlands 3, adjusted for inflation, you'd be looking at grabbing an RTX 2060. Let's run Borderlands 3 on the RTX 2060 and Borderlands 4 on the RTX 5060 Ti to see how they stack up. Running both games at 1440p, with Borderlands 4 using DLSS 4 quality upscaling, it was a little surprising to see how close these configurations get in performance. The RTX 2060 runs Borderlands 3 a little faster. Towards the end of this example, we're looking at a 48 FPS average versus 44 FPS for the Borderlands 4 RTX 5060 Ti combo, which is 9% better. But in some ways, I was expecting the older Borderlands title to run quite a bit better on mainstream hardware of its time when compared to the more taxing Borderlands 4. I guess when you run the game on an RTX 5060 Ti first and see how well it runs, you forget that this GPU is genuinely much faster than equivalent GPUs from 6 years ago. When setting both games to the high preset, things actually flip the other way. Borderlands 4 on the 5060 Ti was able to hit a 60 FPS average, whereas Borderlands 3 on the 2060 was only capable of 52 FPS, giving a 15% advantage to the newer combination. On the medium presets, the newer combination was again around 8% faster, and then on low settings, both configs delivered about the same level of performance. This is a pretty interesting discovery because it suggests that Gearbox Software had the same sorts of performance targets in mind for Borderlands 4 as they did for Borderlands 3, relative to the available mainstream hardware of the time. On $400-ish GPUs, each title runs at around 60 to 70 FPS using the middle sort of setting, so high, medium, that sort of thing. There's a couple of issues with this though. The first is that Borderlands 3 at launch did not run particularly well, and lots of people complained about its performance, a bit like Borderlands 4. So to aim for the exact same sort of performance at launch on comparable hardware 6 years later is a bit of a fail, and really the developers should not be surprised at the level of complaints because they didn't really learn anything from last time. It would have been a lot better if they recognized the issues with the previous title on PC and aim for a better experience this time around, especially because this performance target means a lot of gamers with older GPUs will find it hard to reach the bare minimum 60 FPS. The second issue is that aiming for the exact same target fails to understand the change in acceptable standards over time. High refresh rate monitors are now more common than back in 2019, as are higher display resolution, so PC gamers today are more likely to desire a 1440p high refresh experience than they were years ago. Thinking that nothing would change in the PC space between game releases is a bit naive in my opinion. Borderlands 3 has quite bad traversal stutter too, something that also plagues Borderlands 4, and that's with Borderlands 3 not being a true open world game with smaller areas to explore. Again, you'd think the developers would see this issue and vow to fix it with the follow-up release, but no, that didn't happen. Have the developers also relied on upscaling to hit their performance targets? Well, yes, but I don't think that's especially unreasonable given most people enable upscaling these days, and the quality of anti-aliasing through DLSS 4 quality upscaling is better and sharper than running Borderlands 3 at native resolution with TAA. The issue is the performance target itself is too low. If the game ran well with upscaling enabled, no one would be complaining, and you'd probably still enable it anyway to achieve a better frame rate as opposed to playing at native res. Let's explore the potential reasons why Borderlands 4 is so performance intensive and the upgrades that have been made versus Borderlands 3. When comparing two games that came out many years apart, it's pretty easy to forget what the older game actually looked like. I think in general we always remember old games looking better than they truly do when compared to newer games. Some of the improvements made to Borderlands 4's design and visuals are very obvious, but other improvements are more subtle, and you may not have realized what's been upgraded until you directly compare it to Borderlands 3. The big change is Borderlands 4 is now a true open world game. You can explore most areas without loading screens. Borderlands 3 had open areas, but each area was relatively small and connected either through pathways with loading screens or the fast travel system to other planets, again with loading screens. True open world games tend to be more taxing on system resources, so I suspect that has played a role in how Borderlands 4 runs. Another large change is Borderlands 4 moves to a real-time lighting system, including a full day-night cycle. Borderlands 3 also had a day-night cycle, but lots of lighting elements were baked in and did not dynamically change. So the position of shadows, as an example, would remain static even if the sun moved. Real-time lighting is much more expensive than baked lighting, so this will be a huge contributing factor into the performance difference between the games, but it's also more realistic and on high settings looks better. However, there's issues with using real-time lighting in this way. It becomes very difficult to scale it down without producing artifacts that baked lighting simply doesn't have. For example, if we compare Borderlands 4 on the low preset to Borderlands 3 on Badass, shadows are clearly being rendered at a much lower resolution in Borderlands 4. The newer game does not switch over to using efficient baked lighting at lower presets, it instead cranks down the resolution of the lighting effects, which is just not able to compete with the clarity of shadows in Borderlands 3. This is a big reason why the low preset in Borderlands 4 can look worse and run worse than Borderlands 3 on Badass. Borderlands 4 uses Unreal Engine 5's Lumen feature for full software ray trace global illumination. This significantly improves the quality of lighting throughout the game, and again is a big reason why I believe Borderlands 4 looks much better than Borderlands 3. We get more realistic light fall off and interactions with surfaces, including proper bounce lighting that changes in real time depending on the time and weather. This creates much more depth to the presentation, whereas lighting in Borderlands 3 can look a lot flatter in comparison. This tends to be most noticeable in indoor areas where the effects of bounce lighting are most visible. In Borderlands 4, light interacts through windows and doorways in a more natural way, bouncing around the room, whereas in Borderlands 3, the interactions between the sun and indoor lighting, for example, are much simpler and less realistic. Yes, lighting does change in Borderlands 3 over time, but it's mostly color and intensity changes to parts of the baked lighting system. In addition, most elements in Borderlands 4 generate light and interact with the scene, whereas in Borderlands 3 there are many lights that do not cast accurate shadows or impact other aspects to lighting in any way. The problem facing Borderlands 4 is that Lumen is used across the board, even on the low preset, which sets a high floor to the overall rendering cost. This can make Borderlands 4 lighting on low look superior to Borderlands 3 on Badass, but it also means there is no baked lighting or less computationally intensive fallback that gamers can use on older or slower GPUs. I think that this, combined with fully real-time lighting and a move to a true open world, is why the lowest Borderlands 4 presets are unable to deliver the same performance as Borderlands 3 maxed out. And ultimately, this is an optimization issue. It's time-consuming to implement multiple lighting techniques and efficient fallback systems, but doing so makes the game more optimized and more likely to run on a wide range of hardware. It doesn't really seem like Borderlands 4 has been designed with low settings in mind. There are other aspects that have been improved going from Borderlands 3 to 4, especially on higher settings. Reflections, for example, now use a combination of software ray tracing and screen space reflections, which is pretty noticeable on water. Borderlands 3 seems to use cube maps on water, which can easily become misaligned, and they look much flatter and less realistic than the reflections in Borderlands 4. But the flip side of this is that Borderlands 4 on low removes lumen reflections and resorts to screen space only. So at some angles this setting looks worse than Borderlands 3 because you don't see any reflections at all, whereas at least Borderlands 3 does give some cube maps. Borderlands 4 light interactions with your gun are noticeably improved and look really good, though again, this is an area that doesn't scale down to the Borderlands 3 level. Even the low preset looks better than Badass in the old game. Could performance have been improved further, nerfing this sort of effect back to Borderlands 3 type visuals? Improvements to foliage are a bit hit and miss. Trees look quite similar in both games, though there's a bit more dynamic movement in the newer title. Grass, though, is significantly more dense in Borderlands 4 on the highest settings. It now looks much more in line with the rest of the game visually, and there are new lighting interactions with grass like shadows cast from each element. But then as far as scaling goes, the low preset removes most of the grass and shrubs from the world, which makes it look empty and flat, and doing so can't match the performance of Borderlands 3 with visible grass. This is a big reason why the low preset in Borderlands 4 looks worse than badass Borderlands 3. Borderlands 4 appears to be more detailed overall, though this is always a hard comparison because we don't really see identical items or areas across the two games. But typically, model quality is higher and more detailed in the new game, guns are more interesting and detailed, texture quality is a bit better even though both titles use a cel-shaded style, and the overall item density is higher as well. The draw distance in Borderlands 3 isn't bad on the highest presets, but is surpassed in Borderlands 4, especially for foliage. In most comparisons, Borderlands 3 looks a bit flatter than Borderlands 4 when we compare the highest presets in both, and things like ground textures in Borderlands 3 are not particularly amazing. So there are definitely upgrades in this area. Whether or not Nanite was needed to do so is another question that this sort of investigation can't really answer. The problem with Borderlands 4 again though is that the low preset nerfs a lot of detail and still can't get back to the performance of Borderlands 3. The game on low looks quite blurry and muddy a lot of the time, a regression compared to the best settings in Borderlands 3, and much of the draw distance and foliage detail is stripped away. Some elements still have more detail in Borderlands 4 on low than Borderlands 3 on badass, but in general, I don't think it looks as good because of cutbacks to surface detail and density. There's not much more to say about this game really, and based on what I've examined today, I think it will be difficult for Gearbox Software to significantly improve performance without reworking aspects to the visuals. They'd probably have to do away with things like dynamic lighting and copious global illumination, and while I'm not a game developer, I imagine creating a fallback would be expensive and time-consuming. With that said, it will be interesting to see what sort of compromises are made to get this game running on the Switch 2. That version was recently delayed, so maybe some things are being worked on, and if so, hopefully those improvements are brought to PC. So anyway, that's it for this video. If you do appreciate the work that we do here at Hardware Unboxed, please consider subscribing and also signing up to our Patreon page. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you get access to some pretty cool benefits, BTS content, Discord chat, great place to talk about your favorite games and PC hardware, and all sorts of other good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.